Scripture reading this morning comes from Leviticus. We'll have two passages here, one from chapter 19 and one from 25, which is on the screen here. I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we've gone through a sermon series on Leviticus, and quite often, I remember back then, and even maybe a lot of times, we talk about all the rules that they spoke about in Leviticus. And sometimes even among Christians, we talk about, well, the Old Testament is not relevant. Well, so wrong. That is so wrong, because these two verses that we're going to read today are one of the best verses I find in Leviticus, and it's actually as relevant at the time it was written as it is today. So here's God's word on Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9 to 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. And then we'll go to Leviticus 25, and we'll be reading from verse 35 to 38. It's on the screen here, we can follow. If any of you fellow Israelites become poor and unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. This is the reading of the word.
Before our guest comes up this morning, thank you, David, for reading the word, and also worship team. I want to just remind you, there's one thing that I didn't get in there. The 30 days of prayer for the Muslim world starts on May 6th, which is Monday, and we have prayer guides that are out on the lobby table before you go. Our guest also has a table in the back with information, and I think he'll probably hang out there for a minute or two following the worship gathering if you have questions or follow-ups with that. So I want to encourage you with that. And yes, so without any more, I don't have a long introduction this morning, but I have a bit of a story. 2 stories, in fact. So I was at Blue Ocean, which is this leadership development thing in the NAB, and it was great. I found some of my people there, the Anabaptist Baptists, some of them were there. It was great. And so I went early to Chicago and thought, it'll be good, because I, in the past, have gone right, and it starts that evening, and then I'm kind of exhausted going right into it. And I thought, this will be fun. So I went to visit a Frank Lloyd Wright studio and house there, and a Unity Church that he built, or architect for. And the first tour I get into, there's 3 of us, right? And so I'm in Chicago, and it's me and a couple. And so I got chatting with this couple, and turns out they live about 15 blocks from here, and they're from Vancouver. Go figure that one out. So anyway, and then turns out that they're not only that, they're Christian, and they go to an Alliance church in the area. So I just thought, this is crazy town, all the way into Chicago, and I'm like neighbors down the street, basically, very close to one of our home churches meets too. So I thought that was interesting. The other story is, so I had talked with John Paul Moran, and I'm murdering his name, but he was the director for JustWork. And I did my, usually within a week or 2, I always do a final follow-up with any guests that we have, because I had one bad experience once where a guest did not show up in a church, and that was not a good thing. Fortunately, I was there to fill in, but I was in town in that case. And so I learned my lesson early on. Always, always, always double and triple check with the guest, because sometimes things fall through the cracks. And I got sort of this weird cryptic message from him to call him, and it turns out that he is in transition out of the role. But fortunately, there is someone serving in the interim and is a part of their board with JustWork, which is a social enterprise ministry here in Vancouver, and we're going to hear all about that in just a second. So Russell and I go way back, about 4 or 5 days or so, And so we want to give a warm pilgrim welcome to Russell Pinson as he comes to share about the work of JustWork here in Vancouver. So Russell, would you come on up this morning? And we're glad to have you. Thank you, sir.
You can actually leave them. I shouldn't turn I realize it's
Okay.
easier. It's my fault.
Whatever you want. It's all
I
yours.
this before, and I thought it might be easier to actually use a table. Hi, so maybe first disclaimer is if I have a strange accent for some of you. So it's from people are curious about this. So I'm from the States originally in Georgia. So if you hear this weird twang, that's what causes it, basically. Yeah, so briefly sorry, I just had it close enough. So I've been on the board at JustWork's since 2014, and like he just said, I just stepped into this interim role about 2 weeks ago. So a little fresh, but I'm very familiar with the organization and have been connected to the community for over a decade as well. So I know it for a while, even though this role is new. And one of the things, so what I'm here to talk about is actually two things that I'm very passionate about. It's both what does God say about work in the Bible and also just work, which fortunately enough, I'm going to talk about how those two interact with one another. And it's actually a lot of fun for me to talk about this and more about kind of God's work piece. I actually came here to study years ago, and the whole reason for my study was really to explore what does God say about work and how can you work differently. So it's something I'm really interested in. And because of that, I'm going to say a lot of different points around this. But unfortunately, I can't unpack all of those things, and some of them may be provocative, but feel free to push back at me afterwards and we can talk more about it. But I would like to go into them in more depth, but just time won't allow it. So you'll just have to accept my apologies for that up front. So we'll start looking at what does the Bible say about work. And so that's the first piece of. And the first thing I think that the Bible talks about is that work is inherently good. I say this maybe this is second nature for some of you, but I don't know that everyone thinks of work as good. I think it's often seen as a necessary evil or something you just have to do to make a living or whatever. And then if you could, people wouldn't work and would just have leisure lots of time and hang out with friends or whatever that may be. That's what it's often viewed as work as a temporary thing that we don't want to have to keep doing. But I kind of want to challenge that because, and some of the ways you can see this is if you look in Genesis 2:15, you'll see that work was actually part of the Bible before the fall. Adam and Eve were called to tend the garden and care for it before anything bad happened. So work was built in as a good thing. So I think it's just important to remember that. And as you'll see here on the slide that shows up, that said, I understand that there are good and bad types of work. Work can be life-giving or life-draining. So I'm not saying that all work can be wonderful and without problems, but and equally, there's good and bad rhythms to work. If you work all the time and there's no rest, whether it's 15-hour days or whatever that may be, or just highly stressful, that's not a good thing in and of itself, or good thing either. But just like Sabbath is built in as a rest, and you see that all throughout the Bible. And I actually remember Eugene Peterson saying that Sabbath is the most often commanded commandment in the Bible, and also the least listened to, or often ignored, or most often ignored. And that really struck me because it seems like something you would want to take. It's a gift, and yet it's often something that people don't seem to want to build in. So I say those first 2 points because you'll see the third bullet on here is because, go back for a second, is work itself, like I said, is not something we should overcome. So it's not, there's good and bad types of work and good and bad rhythms, but we're not trying to just do away with work permanently. There's some goodness to it. I think it's just how you find healthy rhythms and what work looks like so that it can be joyful. But so that's the first point I want to make, and just make sure that we can understand some of that. The second point is God blesses all types of work. Now, what I mean by this, I don't know what your backgrounds are or familiarity with the church, but for myself, I had at least this unspoken view of how church work was viewed. There was sort of an implicit hierarchy in terms of what work was deemed important. It was pastoral work or missionary work. These were, if you were really serious about your faith, you did these things. And then maybe, some sort of tiers underneath that where maybe there's some social care, maybe you're in health services or you're a teacher or someone, and it sort of moves on down, and then sort of on the margins are like accountants, stockbrokers, lawyers, these types of things are sort of like, well, we'll permit them, but it's, that's sort of how it's looked at. And really the primary benefit for these other jobs is largely to fund the more important work. That's what you're there for, is to get the money and then give it to the ones that are really doing important things. And then maybe, then of course, in the New Testament, then it's now that Jesus has come, well, and you can also evangelize to your coworkers as well. That's the extra thing you can do, and it's a part of giving more. Now, I say this not because I don't think sharing about God is a good thing. I do, but I think there's a lot more to work than just what you earn to give to something else, or what you can say about your faith to others. I think the nature of the work itself is important, and I think God shows that as well. And so the first point you can see on here is, I find it interesting that the first mention of the Spirit of God coming upon someone, it wasn't to one of the church fathers like Abraham or Moses or any of these kind of spiritual giants that come across early in Genesis, but it's actually on a craftsman who's there to build the ark and other materials. So it's skills of, metal work and wood carving. This is where the Spirit falls on first, not these other, more notable people that usually are talked about later on. So I mentioned that to start with. And then the second piece, drawing from the New Testament in Luke, is when both tax collectors and soldiers come to Jesus asking, what are we to do? You may imagine he would say, leave these shady, despicable jobs and come follow me. There's quite a lot of tension there around soldier occupation in Jerusalem by the Romans, and also tax collectors extorting quite a lot. These were not professions that the rest of the Israelites were very thrilled about and looked quite down upon them. And so it's very interesting when you read this passage that Jesus tells them, don't extort more than you should. Don't take more money from taxing as you should, or as a soldier kind of use your power to influence more money, and also be content with your pay. So it's very important. Jesus seems to show that the nature of their work is actually very important, and something about this is inherently good in and of itself, and not something they just need to do away with now, which I think that's also something that we may tend to forget. I at least know it's something I was not very aware of for a while. So I say that because I think it's also sort of an implicit way of showing that God is giving dignity and importance to all types of work. Now I say all types. I will name that, in the Bible there's at least, for the most part, 2 to 3 jobs that really, it's sort of outlaws. There's witchcraft, which you see in the Old Testament, and prostitution, which are 2. And so these are the ones that are sort of just don't do these. But apart from that, you really don't see a whole lot in terms of this spectrum. These are jobs that you just shouldn't get involved in. So I just mention that because it's often sort of some implicit views that if it's anything is not morally perfectly pure, then we should be away from it. And yet part of, I think, what the Bible talks about as being salt and light is, in some sense, you're present there to even change the way it's carried out. And in fact, the metaphor of salt is usually it's scattered, and the metaphor is it's usually on what would be a rotting carcass of meat, and yet the salt draws out the flavor of the meat and preserves it from actually deteriorating. So there's some sense of, maybe that's a little bit stark in terms of how you want to look at the job place that is this rotting piece of meat otherwise, but there's something about that in the sense that it's drawing out the goodness of what's there and preserving that. But that also means that you are scattered out in these different places. And then, of course, kind of just an aside, you talk about the importance of church every week. I think there's also the sense of gathered, where you're on a hill. So it seems that the Bible has both metaphors. You're scattered out, and then you come back together. So there's a bit of both of that. But that's just a little bit I wanted to say more about how I think God looks at the variety of work, and there's dignity in all these types of work. And the third topic I want to talk about that I think I want to emphasize about work in the Bible is that work structures are not neutral. This for me was something that I was not used to, really thought much about before coming up here. I largely thought about it as you have your personal individual ethics. So when I think about when I was working before coming up here, largely how I thought about ethics in my workplace, which is sort of business and consulting and IT was, don't steal office supplies and don't lie about things. That was sort of the extent of what I felt like it meant to be a morally good Christian. And then apart from that, if everyone did that, then everything would just work well. But the more I've looked into the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament, I think you see a lot more that work structures in and of themselves can be a blessing or can, in some sense, inhibit some blessing. And, Leviticus, despite a lot of the reputation about all these irrelevant, boring laws, I think there's actually a lot of richness here because it's basically a case study on what it means to live out what it means to be God's people. And so 2 passages I want to talk about that briefly. One is Leviticus 25, which is known as the Jubilee laws. So those of you know about this, this is where every 50 years, basically, the land is returned back to the family ancestry. And this can be very controversial because it seems like forced reappropriation of land. And I won't go into this a lot, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think this is actually it's a leasehold structure where you're not allowed to sell it permanently. You're only allowed to lease it. And it's sort of done this way to basically keep families together in relationality. Instead of people having to sell and move out elsewhere so they can't be connected, it's structurally set up where you cannot sell it permanently. And I think the whole purpose of that is to keep people together in relationships. So, like I said, I won't unpack more of that. I don't have time, but I just think it's worth noting that it's not just sell, do whatever you want in this structure, but it's somehow built around how we can account for differences in productivity or misfortune or whatever, but yet there's still some limits on individuality in terms of how these choices are made. It just puts limits on inequality, but it doesn't stop it. So that's one thing. And the other is what we heard today, which is that was called the gleaning laws, which is Leviticus 19 and 10, which we heard earlier on. And as you heard, it talks about how basically you're meant to leave part of the grain from your fields so that the foreigner and the poor can gather. It's a means so that they can also participate. And it's basically designed to care for the vulnerable amongst us. This is a structural piece they built in on how you are, in some sense, to limit your efficiency as a business or owner or whatever, or productivity for the sake of others. So there's a restraint, basically, on your profitability or greed, or however you want to refer to it. And then the last, kind of around this, sometimes when people hear these laws, they think, wow, this sounds very far-fetched and ideal. Lots of, you think about people say, who can keep whatever the law may be. While not unpacking all of that, I think I want to at least say that laws in the Bible are meant to be baseline levels, not ideals you strive for. And so the example I would give is, if you think about the 10 Commandments, do not steal. That's a base level, but I think God would want to see us go beyond that to being generous. That, it's not just don't kill someone, but hopefully there's some be kind, care for one another. So these are base levels. They're not meant to be all we strive for and how we care for one another. I say that so that when you read these pieces, these examples of these structures, think that there's ways to think beyond this and how we can care well for one another. It's just these laws are sort of put in place so things don't get any worse than this. Do you see what I'm saying? Because I think the whole point on how a lot of the law is structured is really around helping relationality amongst people. How can we relate well to one another? And the whole point is how we can preserve that. And this is a lot of what the law is doing to help us live well together. And some aspect of structure to work seems to be important on how we can live well together. So that's how I'll say that for a second. And maybe I don't know if we can put up the Leviticus 19 passage briefly on the screen, but when you read this, and you'll have to, it's 9 and 10, if you can move ahead. Yeah. So if you can imagine this happening, and you came to, let's say, a place that had people doing this, where people were allowed to glean behind and you weren't gathering everything, what do you think this might say about the approach of one country doing this, the Israelites, versus the surrounding nations? Because this was put in place because it wasn't if you're putting a law in place, it means this wasn't the natural tendency of people. So they're having to put something in here to remind you to behave this way as opposed to however you normally would. So, I think something that's worth asking about this and other texts in the Bible is, what might this say about what they value about social and economic life, that they put these things in place? What does it say about how they value or what values they hold? What does it say about the view of personhood? So I say some of those points. And I think there's also a question of, I understand that we don't live in an agrarian society here in Vancouver, and so there's also questions about what's not relevant for our current context. But I think there are some elements here about values and what is prioritized that we can be mindful of to then think through how we then live in our own context well in light of these things. So I want to call those out because one example you get of how this plays out, some of these pieces, is the book of Ruth. And so if you go ahead, so the book of Ruth, Ruth is both a foreigner and a widow, so meets both of the things that are often emphasized by the Bible. And she's come back with her mother-in-law to Israel to care for her after her husband and her father-in-law have died, as well as her brother-in-law. So they're basically there, quite vulnerable. And what you see if you read the story, she eventually is going to fields to basically take advantage of, not in the negative sense, but the gleaning laws are in place, and she goes to a field to glean as one of these poor and foreigners because they don't have food or means to support themselves. So this is sort of the story. So you're seeing this sort of played out, this Levitical law in this story. And when you read it, what you'll see is, this is quite vulnerable already. She needs this, but there's still quite a bit of concern. These are field workers around. Despite being Israel, safety is not guaranteed amongst the male workers there, and so there's quite a bit of concern, and you can see that in some sense in the contrast by how Boaz is the owner of the field that she ends up going to, and so he sees her working, asks about her, and then sort of chooses to go generous above and beyond what the law requires. To give you an example of how someone kind of goes above what's said, he tells the workers, leave extra grain behind, tells her to go get water when she wants. He offers her a meal when he meets her, and even tells her how to stay close so that she'll be safe, so that the workers won't mess with her, especially in other fields, which seems to be more of a risk. So I name that because you can see here some ways in which people go above and beyond what sort of has happened and how to care for her well. And I think those are some important things to realize. I think it's quite beautiful. And those that you know more about the story, Boaz and Ruth, eventually, this is the line from which Jesse and David and start from an ancestral lineage, which then goes on to Jesus and how they trace it in Matthew. So those are some points on that. And to kind of recap how I understand this relative to the 3 points I mentioned earlier. So if you think the first part, work is inherently good, I think there's a difference in how Ruth is enabled to gather grain versus just giving a bag of grain and showing up. There's something different about doing some work for something versus just receiving something. I think everyone wants to give and be a part of something, and if you're only just receiving, your dignity kind of goes away because you feel there's no value in what you can offer. It's a handout to use it. Not that there's not goodness for that in times of need, but it does change the way it happens if someone can work for something versus just receiving. And so you see work is shown as inherently good here, I think, in the sense of the structure of how the gleanings happen, in terms of there is some work for them to gather. And the second thing is God seems to bless all types of work. This isn't seen as beneath or not an important part of work, this wheat harvesting or barley harvesting. And it seems to be quite important, given that God basically spends a whole book talking largely about it and how it kind of shapes things. And so I think that's something at least to kind of draw out from this story. And then, again, the structure itself is not neutral. Ruth would not be able to get hired as a field worker and be as productive gathering and threshing all of the wheat as the other laborers are. So there's some flexibility built in around such a way that she can do work and participate, but it accounts for some of her different circumstances. So I think that's something else to kind of just draw out on this. So that's kind of a sense of how, a brief overview of how I kind of see elements of work in the Bible, or at least enough to kind of point at for now. And so now I want to talk a little bit about just work and just a bit of overview of it, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I think it matches or aligns to what I've just shared a bit more about work in the Bible. So just work is a social enterprise, and this word will mean different things in different countries based upon tax law and other things. But here it's basically we are businesses in the sense that we are selling products and services, but we also have charitable status, and part of that is because we're not able to our productivity gap between that and a typical business isn't quite the same, and so there's some margin there basically to account for that difference in productivity. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's what Just Work is. And Just Work started back in 2004 when this weekly meal program was run out of Grandview Calvary Baptist Church. And people there, one of the needs that kept coming up when people were talking to those at the meal program were they just can't find work. People won't hire them, or it can't work around some of the challenges they face to finding work. And and of course the church also tried having vocational counseling and others to help maybe we just prepare and train skills, but it just became obvious that the workforce wasn't really designed in such a way that could bring them on in such a way where they could stay. So eventually it led to the idea, well, we need to start something that helps accommodate for this. And so this led to the creation of 3 different business units, or enterprises as we call them. There's a Just Potters, which makes mugs and ceramics and also does workshops for team building and so on. There's a catering business, which lunches, weddings, various pieces like that. And also a renovation business, which will renovate a whole range of houses or multi-unit apartments and so on. So these are all different businesses, and they're basically designed in such a way that people who have various barriers to employment, and that can take a variety of forms, whether it's a physical disability, some mental illness, or addictions and some other means, that basically just means that people aren't able to take and stay with regular employment. So how do we build flexibility around what they are able to do and can be hired? So this is, in essence, what Just Work is designed to do, is how can we care for these people well, to offer them work and give them dignity in how they work. And one of the phrases we like to talk about is we offer a hand up, not a hand out, in that sense. And so that's kind of a brief piece about Just Work. What do I want to say a bit more about this? I think some of the things that have stood out to me about Just Work since I've been involved in it is that it's amazing what difference it makes in terms of people, in terms of the dignity they get in having a job. I don't know if you ever think about this, but usually when you greet someone, usually after names are exchanged, usually the second question that comes up is, what do you do? Or whatever that may be. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're not working, I had that once where I actually took some time off after studying, and I just found myself wanting to kind of explain myself why I wasn't working. It was really hard. It really struck me as to how much of dignity or whatever goes away when you don't have anything to say in that sense. And if you so to have something to say, I make pottery or I make whatever, it really changes people's view of themselves and the fact they are contributing and giving to society. And I think I'm very proud of the products and services we provide. I think we make good pottery, and I would like to think we do good renovations and make good food. It's not we're just doing this and we don't think whatever's produced is good. It's excellent work, and that's what we want to strive towards. So I want to say that. But with that, we do give flexibility for work on how we account for schedules and different things that people can do. And we try to pay a good wage. We strive for living wages for people. So that's something I'm also proud of. and we want people to grow and gain new skills. Now, one caveat on this is some enterprises in this area are more transitional in the sense of we want to train people and then move them on to the traditional workforce. That is a good and noble thing. Largely for Just Work, most people that work here, these are the situations people are in is it's more long-term employment. We don't see this as transitional employment, and that's just, people are at where they're at for different reasons, and we want to meet them where they're at. And if people do move on to find other employment, we will celebrate that and be grateful for that. But it's not our kind of expectation or view that people are moving on and it's a short-term piece. And it's largely long-term employment, and we're excited about that. And some gifts that come with that is a real sense of community and well-being amongst one another and trust. So it becomes family in that sense, beyond just work. Sorry for the pun. It was not intentional in that sense. Yeah, and I think we also try to be collaborative in how we can also empower people. We want to hear their ideas on how we can improve things. And so that, for me, is very important. And so, I think just to so if I were to recap how these pieces I've just said, kind of how I think they reflect the 3 points I mentioned earlier, I think we think work is inherently good, and so we want to offer work to people. We're not giving handouts. It is a hand up on how we can work with people. So that's one thing I think we do. I think there is dignity in all of our work, and so we think pottery making or catering or renos, these are good things, and we want to make good products and services out of it so that we are proud of it and others are proud of it, so they want to use us because of what we're producing. So I think, and it gives dignity to people. So I think that type of work, it is a dignifying work. They're not just cogs in a machine or however you want to think about that. But I also think the third piece is that structures aren't neutral, and we've made structures that try to meet people where they're at and work within that. And so this is some of the ways that I also think Just Work is trying to do this in the different pieces. So that's kind of some pieces I would want to highlight on this. And then I guess I would just close. There was a story shared of a worker not long ago, and he said it's very hard to get up in the morning and often doesn't want to come into work, but he is the driver for one of the Renos teams and one of the few that has a driver's license, I think. And he said, but I come because I know people are depending upon me, and that actually makes me get out of bed and want to go do this. And I find that a beautiful story and something I'm really, it makes me really excited to be a part of the organization that does that. So I think with that, I will close. So thanks.
Thank you, Russell, for sharing this morning. We started exploring this idea of being in a body last Sunday, and this fits just wonderfully in this sense of we are embodied, and what does this mean in terms of how we live out our faith and vocation, like you said. This is just wonderful stuff. And I hope you're all wrestling with this. This is good stuff. He could have unpacked each one of those points and layer. It's beautiful. So thank you for sharing this word this morning.